Greetings and salutations, friends, and this is going to be a very special video because this is actually the first ever reply video that I'll be doing, properly that is. I have of course replied before in the form of comments, etc., but never have I done a video response, so I am not going to guarantee the results are going to be optimal, but nevertheless I felt like what was said in this particular video merits a response, as it is heavily tied to the Witcher series, and well, I wouldn't say I found it insulting or just, offensive, but it is, I think, a very unfair outlook at the issues surrounding the series, and I would probably like to address this particularly because both of the main YouTubers who are discussing the issue count as some of my favorite YouTubers, and therefore I thought it appropriate to make a response. I hope this doesn't become as long and chatty as my analysis of the Witcher trailer, which will be linked in the description down below. But I'm not going to make any promises in this area. Again, this is the first time I'm trying this, so have a little pity, will ya? Anyway, the video in question is named Netflix's The Witcher, the next Game of Thrones Comic-Con panel discussion. It was posted on the channel Red Team Review by Carmine, a YouTuber I have been watching for several years now actually, from I think 2014, sorry, and who's been one of my favorite YouTubers because he has a very down-to-earth, level-headed approach to most areas. And on the podcast with him as one of the hosts is Preston Jacobs, another YouTuber I have been watching for some times now, and many of whose videos I thoroughly enjoy. Nevertheless, in this particular video, he makes several comments that I found worth addressing. I will, of course, be as polite as possible and will try to always remain respectful. So I will do my best to clear out any misconceptions about the show, the issues surrounding it, and give my own take on why I think we are seeing what we are seeing in terms of controversy around the show. The first half of the video is fairly mundane and mostly discusses budget issues and how Netflix is trying to compete with HBO in the massive fantasy show department. So I won't really address that part because I mostly agree or don't really have an opinion. But the second part is interesting for a couple of reasons.
Carmine, you started off by saying this, and I think the real point here is I hate when people tell you it's going to be the next something. That never fucking works out. It never freaking works out. It never works. Like every time someone's like, "Oh, it's the next thing. It's the next thing." This is fresh on my mind because I just watched Stranger Things. It's like with New Coke. It's going to be the next thing. You're going to like this, and no one likes it when you say that.
I completely agree with that sentiment, 100%. Mostly because, well, The Witcher, it's often compared to Game of Thrones, but as someone who has read both book series, watched the television show, and played the games, I can tell you that there's only surface level similarities, like politics being an important issue, both being written by left-wing authors who have their own political biases, of course, and so the books have a certain feel of tragedy or cynicism to them. But the main difference is that at its core, The Witcher is a family drama. It might seem like it has a big cast, and in some ways it does, but it's nowhere near Game of Thrones level of character numbers, and it's very small scale compared to A Song of Ice and Fire and even Game of Thrones. I wouldn't say there's necessarily more thought put into the characters in Witcher or A Song of Ice and Fire, but there's definitely a lot more thought put into the world in Game of Thrones than in The Witcher, where you really have copy and paste kingdoms for the vast majority of the world, with a few exceptions like Skellige, Kovir, and Nilfgaard, for example. But other than that, the world building isn't the greatest. You also have a much higher level of fantasy than Game of Thrones, with again much less thought put into it, and you have a lot more human drama. Now, I'm not saying there's not human drama in A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. There's certainly a lot of it, but The Witcher, it's primarily centered around this very small, very tight-knit group of individuals who go through their individual problems and have a couple of adventures. And that's probably the main difference than The Song of Ice and Fire. You can definitely tell who's the bad guy and who's the good guy in The Witcher. You will have a far harder time doing so in A Song of Ice and Fire. And of course, the books are still not complete, so there's still a lot of unanswered questions. But yes, I definitely agree. If you are going into The Witcher expecting it to be the new Game of Thrones, then I am worried you'll be sorely mistaken and very upset once the show comes up. Of course, you might be upset for a whole number of other reasons we shall discuss, but either way, it's never a good idea to compare two genres so vastly different.
No, no, it's like anywhere when you travel, they say the Paris of wherever, and it's never Paris.
You never.
And this is what I've been trying to tell Preston for a while now. I know for a fact that he would like the series. It's, rooted in a lot of stuff that he likes. There's the feminist aspect there.
Oh, we can debate just how feminist The Witcher is. I mean, Sapkowski has said something along the lines that he believes that women are the stronger gender, both mentally and physically, and other stuff like that. But I wouldn't say the books are feminist in nature, or if they are, they do a really poor job of it. Because most of the characters who you would think represent women in power are goddamn atrocious. Like, they're some of the worst, not just female characters, they're some of the worst characters per se in the entire series. I have never really grasped this angle because, of course, I'm talking about the Lodge currently, and the Lodge always to me seemed like a parody of feminism and of especially third wave feminism, but feminism in general as well. Because I never got the impression I'm supposed to take them seriously. Like, for me, they were comedy stock. They were a satire of real-world feminist politics. And I haven't actually read any interviews with Sapkowski where he specifically speaks about the Lodge. I have read a couple of his interviews where he talks about women in general, and some of his views probably could be classified as feminist. But I'm not sure that the books themselves are feminist in nature or that they have a lot of feminist undertones. Anyway, continuing.
With the sorceresses being very independent, there's that political intrigue there, monster slaying. Like, I know you like that stuff, but there has been some controversy with The Witcher. I should go into it a little bit. Essentially, there was a central, integral character to the series. Her name is Ciri. And in the books, of course, she is very white, like pale, ghostly pale, actually, with ashen hair. And the showrunner wanted to replace this character with a BAME, someone who is, according to what this says, BAME essentially means black and minority ethnic. And there was huge controversy about that because a lot of people were saying, like, the showrunner is being very, quote-unquote, liberal with the casting instead of just, having a faithful adaptation. She's trying to put, like, political undertones here by replacing certain things and, quote-unquote, Americanizing the story.
And after seeing the trailer, I cannot help but agree with some of these accusations. Because, and we'll get to this soon enough when Preston starts making his objections to this, but can anyone tell me a rational reason for why this has been done? Like, I certainly can't think of one, and objectively speaking, there just is none. It's not like there's a reason which is valid, but I just don't like. I can't think of a valid reason why this should be done. Especially with some characters who are quite integral to be portrayed in the way they should be. We also know that Lauren Hissrich has promised that she will not start swapping people's genders and races and stuff like that all over the place just because she's feeling very, very liberal. And this is really funny because her response, and I'll probably make a separate video for her response, which will also cover the entire issue of race bending. Lauren basically claims that she did not do this because she felt liberal, but because they needed to well, how did she say it? They were making a show for 190 countries or some other number like that, and they needed to diversify the cast to attract a wider audience. I'll go into why this claim is a myth in more detail in the other video, but basically, you have no right to say this. You have absolutely zero right to say this, because you can't even imagine how demeaning this is to most people. You know, if it was the case that most people only watch or in general consume media that represents them in some way or that has characters that are like them, can you imagine how few pieces of media I could consume in my life? Here's a trick question. All of you who are watching, and feel free to type in the comments, I'm genuinely curious. Have you ever seen a Slovak character in a non-Czechoslovak piece of media? I can tell you I have one single time seen a Slovak character, and you want to know where? It's a very old Soviet-Ukrainian movie, The Legend of Kovpak, which was released, I think, in the 1970s or in the 1980s, I'm not even sure. And that's the only time I saw a Slovak character in a non-Slovak piece of media. And the character had about 3 minutes of screen time. He was a Slovak general who let the Ukrainian partisans pass through his line of defense because he didn't want to fight them. He had about 10 lines of dialogue and 3 minutes of screen time, and that's basically it. We never see him again. He isn't even mentioned by name in the credits. And that's the only time I've ever seen a Slovak character in a distant piece of media, in a foreign piece of media. And even that's Ukrainian, so it's not that foreign. It's certainly not American foreign or British foreign. And I suspect that most people, especially from smaller countries, but even from larger countries like Ukraine, Belarus, or Finland, have it very much the same. Like, when's the last time you saw a Finnish character? When's the last time you saw a Bulgarian character in mainstream media? I certainly can't recall. And yet, nevertheless, shows which have precisely zero characters of certain ethnicity, race, nationality, etc., 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 have massive viewings in countries they represent to precisely no point. The argument is completely false and doesn't stand to scrutiny. And what really upsets me about this is that this is not just adapting, an American piece of media. This is adapting a Polish piece of media, a very Slavic or at least Central European piece of media, which you'd think would be a chance to describe, more of Polish culture, traditional East German culture, Hungarian culture, so on and so on. And this upsets me greatly because it assumes audiences are either immature or petty, extremely petty. It's very demeaning, in my opinion, to believe that your audience is just so childish and immature that they can't stand to watch someone who doesn't look like them. If that was the case, I would have never, ever grown in terms of literature or media in general, because our television is... I struggle to find words to describe it adequately, but calling it a dump these days would probably be too generous. It wasn't always this way, and the old Czechoslovak film industry was actually very good and sometimes downright masterful. But still, modern day Slovak television, if that's the only thing I consumed because those are the only people who would represent me on screen, well, I would be robbed of many, many opportunities. So no, Ms. Hisrich, this is not how the world works. This is not a valid argument. Anyway, I got off on a tangent already, so let's continue before I completely lose myself.
When it's a Polish story, Poland is religiously and ethnically homogenous, whereas, they write their stories in as such, and then you come over to the United States, it's a vastly different landscape, and some people have an issue with that.
I think Carmine is on the right track here, but I also don't think he entirely understands the problem. I mean, Polish people are not really represented within The Witcher, because there's the common misconception, some fans like to propagate, that Sapkowski was trying to satirize Slavs, and that's why he gave all the stupidest characters Slavic names. I don't think these people understand Sapkowski well enough, and I definitely don't think they know about characters like Vesemir or Visogota, who are some of the most important characters within the story, and both have Slavic names, and that's just the first two that come to mind. But yes, calling it purely Polish would be a misconception. Some of the biggest influences on the Witcher series in general were Celtic mythology, the Arthurian legends, and Sapkowski absolutely adores the legend of King Arthur. And also East German folklore, Ugro-Finnic folklore. Western European influences are certainly to be found, especially in terms of the Novgorodian Empire. It's a mix of various parts of Europe. And that's perfectly okay. First of all, is how the author intended it to be. And second of all, it's still mostly homogeneous in this regard. And this is all perfectly well and good. The problem most people have is not that it's not inherently Polish, but that it's not inherently Witcher. It doesn't look like The Witcher or the inspirations behind the Witcher series in general. It doesn't look European. And I'll get to what it reminds me of as soon as Preston starts talking about this. But in general, it doesn't give off a European vibe the way it is shown. There's too many changes, in my opinion.
First off, like I don't think it's political. Like you say, oh, they're putting in these liberal tones. No, they're looking for money. Okay, black people like to watch black people on TV. White people like to watch white people on TV. Asian people like to watch Asian people on TV. That's just the nature of things.
I will have to disagree. The argument itself makes very little sense to me, especially as someone who has actually, had to consume mostly foreign media in his life. Like white people like to watch white people, black people like to watch black people. Yes, that's true, but more than that, people like to watch stories that entertain them. And it doesn't really matter if the people in that story have a skin color of one or another type. Let me think. Blade. I like the Blade movies. Like, they're pretty hammy in some ways and very corny, but I enjoy them because they're good fun and the main actor is really entertaining. I don't give two damns about whether he is or is not black or white. The character was written as black, he should stay black. Same goes for any other movie I enjoy with a black lead. For example, Men in Black. I really don't care. Well, the first Men in Black. The second was okay, and the third one was atrocious. But the first Men in Black is one of those movies that really defined my childhood. I could not care less if Will Smith is the main character, because at the end of the day, the story is what matters most. And well, Men in Black being a completely original story, set in America at that, it's really not a strange thing to have a black man as the main character, and it doesn't really impact the story in any significant way. So I don't think this is a valid argument, certainly not in defense of all the changes that have been done. And Preston mentions money here. I'd like to know, like, what's the logic behind that? This is an honest question, like, how do you increase sales with this? I'd think that money you spend on hiring diverse actors would better be spent hiring better costume designers, because God knows the show needs them, or any other type of profession, because I don't think that's a good investment. I don't think it's going to increase the sales for any reason. Think Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings had precisely zero diversity in this regard. Like, it had the Haradrim and the Easterlings, which in the source material were also, non-white Eastern looking, so they were actually true to the canon. And yes, they only played a minor antagonistic role. Nevertheless, the Lord of the Rings made insane amounts of money, and they had really nothing in the way of diversity, certainly not in the modern context. And why is that? Probably because the Lord of the Rings already had a massive and tight-knit fan base, which was itching for a good adaptation of the awesome stories told within the Lord of the Rings books. And, well, Peter Jackson really didn't need to resort to any kind of diversity to make these films popular. I struggle to see how this is any different with The Witcher, especially considering The Witcher also already has a very tight-knit and strong fan base which is itching for a decent adaptation of their story. The only thing this is going to do is turn away many fans who are, already saying that the show is not going to be faithful to the books and they will not watch it due to the changes involved. I'm sure these are not a massive loss because most fans are still going to watch it if for no other reason than, like me, to see if it is any good. But I struggle to see how this is good for profit. When the BAME controversy around Cyrilla came out, I honestly thought that it was a stunt piece because, well, these kinds of controversies do tend to generate profit. They tend to generate interest and media attention. So I thought, okay, they're going to have a little bit of controversy, maybe throw in one or two black characters for the good measure, and then, try to appease the fan base as much as possible. And I thought, oh, okay, I mean, it's a scummy tactic. It's definitely not an honest thing to do, but it is still a company we're talking about here, so you can't really expect them to be completely honest with us. And I was expecting something along those lines. And what we got instead was not only the changing of some pretty major characters, but from the trailer, we have all around changes which just either don't make sense or they're just plain bad. And this is, I think, in many cases, an even bigger problem than the characters' races being changed. It's that it affects the story, and in the other video, I'll get to exactly how it affects the story in greater detail. But it also is completely unnecessary. There's no reason for it. The money reason, I honestly struggle to see how that makes any sense. You already know that you could have had a massive profit just from focusing, and not only on the book fans, but on the fans who have only ever played the games as well. If you designed some things maybe to look more like games, or maybe if you at least paid lip service to them, an Easter egg or two, or at least designing the medallions in a similar way, I think that would have been a massive sign of goodwill to a huge demographic, because the Witcher games, like, it's not a true argument that they are what made the books famous, because the books were already fairly well known in Poland and even abroad before the first game came out, but they definitely massively increased the people aware of the Witcher's existence, and that is a pretty huge demographic. So yeah, I really don't think that diversity was required or necessary to increase the profits from the show. But anyway, let's continue for now.
And so when they throw in a character, it's not for liberal reasons or conservative reasons. It's for money reasons. These organizations are not liberal or conservative. They're corporate.
I struggle to see how that's an argument, seeing as corporations, just as any other organizations, are made of individuals. They are made of individual people, and most of these people are not robots. They do have their own opinions and their own political beliefs, and it's really no secret. And the idea that a showrunner would try to insert his or her political bias into a show is actually fairly simplistic, and I don't think anyone could realistically disagree with it. The studio as an entity in and of itself only really cares about profit, it's true, but studios have in recent years been pumping out a lot of very progressive, very left-wing leaning material, which just, it sold poorly. And nevertheless, they kept pouring out more. I mean, even the atrocity that is the Death Note Netflix film, which I detest with every fiber of my being, even that is getting a sequel, despite the fact that it tanked in both reviews and in viewings. So, yeah, and again, the Death Note might actually be a wrong example, because it's not actually even trying to really push any kind of political agenda. It's just a bad piece of media in general. But yeah, I don't think the companies have such a big issue with individual people adding their own ideas into the show, as long as there's that sweet promise of money. Especially if the people inside these companies, or at least the people who are in charge of the directors and the producers, don't necessarily disagree with them.
They care about money, and they're going to do what they think is profitable. If it were profitable just to put white people on screen, that's what they'd do. But they're trying to make money.
Alright, then explain the Gillette situation. I mean, the Gillette ad, which I honestly simply got a good kick out of because, well, I never bought Gillette one way or the other. But even if I did buy it, I would probably have just stopped buying it and not really given much of a toss about it. But that was aimed specifically at a progressive market, and it was not just aimed at it, it was also trying to send a message to its longtime consumers. A rather poorly formulated and objectively false message, but a message nevertheless. So I do think that companies, at least from time to time, also care about different things other than money. I struggle to see how Gillette thought that this would increase their profits to a significant level. Maybe they thought they would get some new progressive buyers, but those aren't a massive demographic. And I generally, I'm not sure whether companies are just stupid or willfully ignorant, or if they're just being misled, because the progressive group in society, even in the US and less so in Europe even, are a very small group, percentually speaking. They're a couple of thousands of people, not much more. And appealing to them is not going to do a massive, is not going to give you a massive increase of new customers. In fact, it's often going to drive away your old customer base who just can't stand them and can't stand virtue signaling in general. So I don't think that this is being done for money. And I don't think why it cannot be done for an ideology, seeing as the show is still being produced by a group of people, a small group of people, of individuals with their own personal beliefs and ideas, who are necessarily, or not necessarily, that's the wrong word, who are very likely going to try and insert at least some of their political biases, and not necessarily even political biases, just their opinions in general, into the piece of media they're developing. And you know what's the funniest thing? This would actually be okay if the piece of media they were developing was originally theirs, and or originally carried the same kind of message they wished to send using it. But this is not the case with The Witcher, as we shall see later.
And so that's what they're doing by throwing.
Well, to be fair to what I said and to counter what you're saying, the showrunner Lauren Hisrich, she literally said on Twitter, "Am I going to change people's ethnicities from the books and the show just because I'm feeling liberal that day? No, I'm not going to do that."
Yes, that is very true. She did promise that, and I was fool enough to get my hopes up. Apparently, word as good as gold is not really a thing these days, but either way, what Carmine is saying now is very true, and well, her response to that is most entertaining, but I'll keep that for a separate video.
But
And then she did just that.
They don't have control over. They don't have the micromanaging kind of stuff over that. People
Yes, she does.
No.
Yes, she does. She was in charge of hiring the cast.
What, the head of Netflix?
No. The showrunner. Like Netflix
the
gives
showrunner.
showrunners incredible like freedom, which is why people love doing shit on Netflix.
That, to the best of my knowledge, is also very true.
But I'm talking about the showrunner. She said, "I'm not going to change anybody's ethnicity because I'm feeling very liberal that day." But then she goes and does just that. And she had humongous control over casting. Say what you will about Dave and Dan. I think they were all agreed on very few people for Game of Thrones. I think it was Sean Bean for Ned and Peter Dinklage for Tyrion. But then the casting director, she came in. I think it's the same casting director for Force Awakens. She came in and she got the best people possible. So the showrunners for Thrones were not as involved in the casting as much as she is with The Witcher. And I don't know, it just seems very, very weird that she has that much control.
This always frustrates me. The everybody thinks that they're everything is getting controlled by some sort of boogeyman from some sort of like political persuasion.
No, we're not talking about a patriarchy in our Preston. And I don't think anyone really believes that there is some kind of massive conspiracy. What most people who I've talked to or whose posts I've read on these issues simply think is that Lauren Hisrich inserted her own political views and the views of her writing staff or her fellow producers into the show. And that there's nothing conspiratorial about that. People do this all the time. And again, I said, if this was a show of her own doing, or her own creative material, something she personally created along with her fellow producers, this would have been a-okay. Nobody would have bat an eye. If people didn't like it, they would have simply not watched it. But this was meant to be an adaptation. When you do an adaptation, you have a certain obligation towards the source material. People are going to have expectations from you and are going to expect that you remain faithful to the source material. And, well, Lauren Hisrich has not done that, and I struggle to see why she would not have done that, except for ideological reasons. Because there's nothing to gain from this, monetarily speaking. You won't increase your profits doing this. It's First of all, it's exceptionally demeaning to think of audiences worldwide as being so petty as to not watch pieces of media in which they are not represented. And second of all, it's also blatantly false because we have numerous examples of shows and other pieces of media with precisely zero diversity or no diversity at all, becoming not only majorly successful but cult icons. And, well, again, I don't know why Preston is jumping to everyone accusing this of being a conspiracy. I have not seen anyone accuse this of being a conspiracy. And maybe there are some people who claim that this is part of some larger racial war or racial erasing in our society that's being perpetuated by political elites or something along those lines, some proper white supremacists. But I definitely haven't actually spoken to anyone like that, nor have I seen anything like this in the mainstream Witcher forums. What everyone is complaining about is simply that Lauren Hisrich not only had the obligation to stay faithful to the source material, but she also explicitly promised that she would, and, well, she broke her promise. And her response to doing this was not even apologetic. She remains convinced that she did no wrong, which is simply inaccurate. And again, it doesn't take a conspiracy to do something like this. Show managers, especially in recent years, do this all the time. Every single media producer is necessarily going to involve at least some of his views in the piece of media he is creating. The question is how controversial those views are and how political they are. But they are going to be the author's views nevertheless. Of course, they don't have to be purely the author's views. The author can also speak to other people and involve their perspectives on certain matters in the story, and such stories usually have an objectively higher quality. But either way, no one would object to this if this was Hisrich's original production, just as nobody objected to Beowulf. And if you don't know what Beowulf is, I don't really want you to find out because it's atrocious, but I had the misfortune of seeing it. And, well, Beowulf, or at least the series I'm talking about, is a couple of years old mini-series. I can't even recall when it came out. I think 2015, but I can't be bothered to check because I just don't want to really remind myself of it. It marketed itself as an interpretation of the Beowulf mythos, as taking a new spin on the Beowulf legend and the old classical poem, meaning they created their own fantasy world, they created their own characters, they created their own mythology for it. They generally just went wild with mythology. It was terrible in most accounts. The costumes were bad, the fighting was pretty terrible. The sound design was also not something fondly remembered. And, well, the most important thing why it comes to mind is that despite being set in an authentically or ostentatiously is the better word, yeah. Despite being set in an ostentatiously northern climate, and despite being focused around Old English poem, the casting was all around in terms of skin color and race. You had Indians, blacks, whites, Asians, and a whole bunch of other minorities and ethnicities living side by side in the same climate. The funniest thing is they actually did have a desert region in their world, and the desert region was inhabited almost purely by white people, which I found hilarious to no degree. But either way, did the show get slammed for, polluting the original mythos? No, at least not to the best of my opinion. It got slammed for just generally being garbage, but nobody really complained about the casting. They just said it was completely unbelievable and unrealistic, given the climate most of the story was set in. And well, I can't really blame the people who would write something like that, because I thought much the same thing. I mean, it was infinitely bizarre to me that the skin tone that Hindus have, the skin tone that most inhabitants of the Middle East have, the skin tones that Asian people have, and the skin tones that Africans generally have, would all evolve simultaneously in a cold, rainy, watery northern climate, which definitely was the case with the main setting of the series. But again, nobody really said this was lore breaking or inaccurate to the source material, because the original Beowulf poem was an inspiration for this series. The series was not marketed as a direct adaptation. And so nobody objected to this on these grounds. They objected to it because it was, well, not immersive and it was not realistic. But generally, people also had a lot more to complain about with the series, and barely anyone watched it in the first place. I just think it's a prime example, because the race bending in that story, or well, the casting in that story, to be more precise, was again all over the place.
Like it's just not. It's really like stuff is done for money reasons and things like that. I mean, maybe some random situation where the showrunner might want a couple people here and there, but these I just don't believe these huge conspiracies. I think it's just like, I don't know. All these YouTube videos that like.
Well, neither do I, Preston, neither do I, but you cannot deny that the race bending did occur, and it's not just a couple of characters. It's not just, one or two extras standing in the background in distinctly exotic clothing. It's, knights in full plate standing in the Cintern court. It's the dryads who look nothing like the dryads in the books. It's Fringilla, it's Yennefer and Triss to a degree, it's Vilgefortz, it's a whole bunch of other characters. It's Thread. I could go on, but I'm honestly too lazy to recount them all. But and those are not just, extras standing in the background. Those are major characters and very highlighted characters. That's the biggest issue. Like, for example, I want to use another example of how this is done well. Outlaw King. Like, Outlaw King is by most standards an excellent historical film, and it has you blink and you miss it. But the scene in the harbor where Robert Bruce and his brothers are going to pay their tribute to the English, and they're delivering the money, we get to see the harbor, and you see a fair few Arabs and black people standing around and trying to sell their goods, or just generally walking around the market. I haven't seen a single person comment on this negatively, because this is actually an authentic medieval experience. I think this was in Edinburgh where they submitted the money, although I could be wrong. So it was a major port especially for Scotland. And it really wouldn't be too out of place to find a foreign merchant, and not just, African or Middle Eastern, but also German, French, Spanish, and any other number of nations and ethnicities trying to sell their goods, because the ports were the traditional meeting hub for all these cultures. It's where people could stay and sell their wares as best they could. And it's probably also the place that attracted the most diversity in a medieval period. But this is not what The Witcher does. And The Witcher is very definitively a world with diverse races and diverse skin tones, but those are all coded specifically to one or more parts of the world. And it's never ever mentioned about most of these characters having different skin tones in the books. And you know how we know this? We know this because there are actually characters with different skin tones mentioned in the books, specifically in the story The Bounds of Reason, about the Golden Dragon Hunt, where you have two foreign warriors from Zerrikania, Thea and Vea, who immediately stand out in the crowd because they are dressed in furs of exotic animals and they have swarthy skin, like the Middle Eastern skin tone. And they are also armed to the teeth with sabers and just generally have a very Middle Eastern, Turkish/Kurdish aesthetic. And, well, I'm wondering how you're going to translate the same sense of, exotic wonder, especially because there's also another scene where Cyrilla goes to a marketplace in Gorsvelen, yes, in the city, and she sees a whole bunch of different exotic wares trying to sell animals from distant countries, furs, pelts, jewelry, you name it. The scene really illustrates what a medieval marketplace was. It was a place where all kinds of people met and tried to scam each other. So yeah, I really, I'm going on a tangent here again, but I don't think you need a conspiracy for something like this.
All these YouTube videos that I see constantly that are like, damn those SJWs with their goddamn Captain Marvel, like come.
Well, I'm wondering what kind of videos you're watching, Preston, in that case, because I haven't seen a single one of these videos. I have seen a fair few videos satirizing Captain Marvel, but I'm not going to talk about these at length because I haven't actually seen Captain Marvel herself. I generally don't watch Marvel movies, so that shouldn't really come as a surprise. I didn't watch it not because of any particular ideology. I didn't watch Infinity War or Endgame either, because I just don't like the Marvel superhero genre. And I'm not going to comment on this, but either way, there's not... I haven't seen a single video like this about The Witcher. There have been videos which have addressed the controversy, but even they have almost tiptoed around the issue, as if they're afraid of awaking some kind of sleeping giant. I don't think there's a single video which actually just, spurgs out and starts, just blaming SJWs for all of its faults. But even if it was, it would be unprofessional and it would be childish, but it would objectively not be wrong, because Lauren Hezrich does have a lot of traits that SJWs do possess and shares a lot of her viewpoints with them. So calling her an SJW might not be strictly accurate, but she definitely is of the same mindset and of the same political beliefs. And I'm still waiting for an explanation why these things would be done, if not for ideology. Because again, I don't see how this could be done for money, and no other motive comes to mind.
No, people are just trying to make money.
I agree. Yeah, exactly. Even those YouTubers as well. Like nobody gives a fuck about Captain Marvel.
Here's a reverse situation. Okay, one thing that I always got like a kick out of they've been breaking away from this now, but like in the 80s and 90s, when you see a couple on TV, like it's always a black guy married to a black woman, or a white guy married to a white woman, or an Asian person married to an Asian person. They would have interracial friendships. But it was really weird that you wouldn't see interracial relationships on TV very much.
I wonder why that is. And I actually went to look up a few data about this in the Pew Research Center, and it specifically states that in the 1980s, and it specifically compares the 80s to the modern period, interracial relationships, or interracial marriage in particular, only constituted about 6% of the entirety of marriages in the US. And that's the US. The US has some of the largest minority groups in the entire world. Well, at least in the entirety of the Western world, especially in the 80s. I'll try and link to the statistics that I found about this in the description down below, but basically, I don't see how this is strange because, well, what you're presumably talking about, at least I assume you're talking about this because you're talking about interracial friendships and couples, and that just screams to me reality shows or drama shows or something along those lines. Those shows usually depict the reality in which they exist, and well, the reality in which these shows existed was one in which interracial marriage was almost non-existent, or at least it wasn't very mainstream. And even when interracial marriage, when I actually went through the statistics about this, the two main groups in America who actually intermarry are the Hispanics and the Asians, usually to each other. So having multiple interracial relationships in a country which at the time only had 6% of its total marriages be interracial, and of that an even smaller percent be actually, prominent or common, it would be very strange, and there was no reason to do that because, again, these shows were trying to depict the reality in which they lived and either satirize it or simply portray it as it was. But I don't think there's anything particularly political about that. It just reflects the world in which the shows were produced and in which they existed.
80s and 90s. And now when I see a show like Jane the Virgin, which goes out of their way, it seems almost to have every single relationship be interracial. I'm like, I like notice it and I get a kick out of it. And
Preston actually put it really accurately here. It almost seems like it goes out of its way. I wonder why. I wonder if maybe, just maybe, the creators of these shows have agendas which they are going to try and distribute through the media they create. I think this is an almost obvious answer. Like, every single author in the world is going to try and promote his political beliefs in what he creates. And although, no, I said it wrong, not necessarily political beliefs, but his beliefs in general. Because he is the author of this material, and he's probably going to write what he knows and what he understands and what he believes. And again, there's nothing really wrong with this. If the general public likes it, well, then it's going to have success. If it doesn't like it, it fails. What people have an issue with is taking something pre-established and then changing it just because you wish to sell your political agenda, and you know that it probably wouldn't sell well on its own, so you try and promote it through something already popular, which people are going to enjoy for all the reasons which are not related to the political agenda. It's a fairly simple tactic, and there's nothing conspiratorial about it. And also another thing is, unlike the shows that Preston mentioned from the 80s, these still do not accurately represent the proportion of interracial marriages in the modern world. Because even in the modern world, interracial marriage still constitutes barely 15% of marriages in total within the US. Now, that's certainly a massive increase, at least compared to the 1980s. But it's not sudden and massive, escalation. It's a natural increase as, race relations get more relaxed and people start experimenting a little more. It's nothing overwhelming, and it's still certainly not a mainstream thing. It's not something most people do, especially not in the dominant population, because white Americans, Caucasians, they actually intermarry the least out of all these groups. And in the media, which is a funny thing I notice, a white woman is frequently paired with a man from a different race or ethnicity. It's just a trend that I've been noticing within the trend of promoting intermarriage in modern day media. And I struggle to see how this is anything but promoting an agenda, but promoting a worldview. And again, any one of you can try and prove me wrong in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. I'm not saying I know everything about this. struggle to see any different reason besides ideology for doing things like this. It doesn't accurately reflect the reality, and neither should it, because, well, in this case we're talking about a fictional world. It doesn't accurately reflect the source material either. It's going to alienate longtime fans who want to see as faithful an adaptation as possible, and I struggle to believe that it's going to draw in new people, because again, people are not petty enough to only watch things in which they can see themselves. Personally, for me, although maybe I am just an outcast in this regard, I like to watch things that are about people who are different than me, better than me, ideally, because, well, I already live my life. Maybe not to the fullest, but I do live it. I have some experience in living life, and I don't want to see a repeat of that. Like, I like to see characters who are as different as me and preferably much more interesting than me, because I already live my life. I don't need to relive it again. I want to see something new, something interesting. And I suspect vast majority of people, at least certainly almost all the people I know, want to see something similar. I know probably only one person I know has ever told me that he likes a film because it really reminds him of himself, and that person is a self-admitted narcissist, so, well, take that as you will. But other than him, no one has ever told me they like something because it depicts someone who is like them, and certainly not in the physical department, in the way the characters look, and even in the way the characters behave and act. This is not a very frequent thing. From my experience, people like characters they can sympathize with, not which they can identify with. Characters who have some things in common with them, especially when it comes to perspective on certain issues and mindsets, but not characters who are them or who are like them, and certainly not physically.
It's just something I'm also aware of because I'm married to somebody that's not my race. But when I see that on TV, like I remember this Chili's commercial or something where a white woman, a black woman, and an Asian woman are actually eating, and then this hot white waiter and a hot black waiter and a hot Asian waiter come up, and the three women like stop and like drool over these three men, as if like it would be inconceivable that they could drool over somebody of a different race. Now, when I looked at that, I wasn't sitting there going, "God damn conservatives!"
First of all, I highly doubt that the main purpose of the ad was to actually, promote, marriage into the same race. I'm not sure what the ad was about because I personally have never seen anything like it, and I failed to find it. If anyone knows what Preston is talking about and can link to it, I would like to see it. But I have high doubts that Preston is that he's comparing fairly in this regard, because ads usually don't promote race relations. I mean, even the Gillette ad, which is probably one of the worst ads ever made, still made an effort to at least tangentially promote, shaving razors. And, well, I think what the ad was instead doing was just poking fun at reality, because if you think that marriage into the same race is, very common in the US, then South America, well, depends on which part of South America, but Chile for certain, that's a whole different can of worms, at least to the best of my knowledge. And I really don't think that this is an accurate comparison, because first of all, this ad is for all intents and purposes original. I really, really doubt that this was, taken from some kind of source material and made into an ad. So it's completely original, and the creator has absolute creative freedom to cast whoever he wants for the ad. Second of all, I don't think the ad was trying to push any agenda, because it was simply observing reality, and the reality is that intermarriage between various races is very low, because unlike the argument that people like to only see themselves on TV, most people do actually prefer to marry someone who is of their race or of their nationality, because it makes a lot of things easier, because, well, in most countries in the world, different nationalities also mean different cultures and different languages and so on. And most people prefer to marry people they can understand easier and who are closer to them culturally and in mindset as well. And this is a general trend all over the earth, and I can't really see how promoting such a thing would be conspiracy if that's what the ad was doing. I really don't think it was promoting this idea that only blacks can marry blacks, only Asians can marry Asians, and only whites can marry whites. Because that's not really trying to push for something that doesn't exist. That's just stating something that already exists. Here's an example, an ad I have actually seen some time ago, which goes directly against the trend shown in the Chilean in the Chilean ad Preston mentions. In Slovakia, one of our ads, and I remember this because it was very funny to me, stated to marry a Slovak woman that's, sort of Arabic, French, Persian, Norwegian, English, American, Russian, Hindu, and African, but to marry a Slovak man, now that's something only Slovak women do. The ad was, of course, primarily based around, I think, selling some kind of new bottled water, which was authentically Slovak or something along those lines. But the thing about it is, it wasn't trying to promote Slovak women marrying abroad. It was not even, trying to promote anything social. It was merely stating a trend, and the trend does actually exist. And that's because, well, Slovak women are very, very attractive, and Slovak men in general are not. Well, Slavic men in general, in fact. It's a common joke that we have been enslaved historically so many times because we have the hottest women around, and the men are just too ugly, so the women willingly throw themselves into slavery just to get away with them. Of course, the joke is not historically accurate, just in case someone accuses me of, rewriting history, but it's a common joke. I've heard it hundreds of times in Slovakia, but it's a joke. It reflects reality. It satirizes reality, and it doesn't try to actively push for people to marry abroad, men or women from any kind of nation. It's just satirizing reality, and I think that's the same thing that the Chilean ad was doing, because generally this is the dominant trend. People tend to prefer to marry into their own nation, their own race, etc., because it's easier, it's more convenient most of the times. This doesn't mean that it's inconceivable or that it's heretical to marry outside your race, and more power to you if you manage to get married and stay married at all in this day and age. But either way, I just don't see the comparison between comparing a random ad which was making fun of a stated fact, which is a part of the reality we live in, it's a part of the world we live in, and actively going out of your way to change the source material of an adaptation you did not create. You are merely adapting it. You are not its masters, you are simply its stewards. I just fail to see the comparison.
And their anti, race mixing agenda. I wasn't sitting there freaking out about it. And it's like,
well, no one is, I think, freaking out about it, Preston. At least I'm certainly not. I'm just saddened by the level of disrespect this speaks of. What I'm freaking about is the goddamn Nilfgaardian army.
Fucking EW.
Because, my god, I am convinced I'll get eye cancer from looking at that. I'm not going around screaming at the top of my lungs. I'm just, kind of amused, because this is definitely going to prove fertile ground for more memes and more jokes in the future. But I'm also quite saddened, because I was looking forward to the Witcher adaptation. For me, The Witcher, well, it's not the best story I have ever read. That honor goes to a very, very different kind of story, but The Witcher for me has a lot of nostalgic factor and a lot of cool factor. And I generally was really looking forward to seeing it interpreted on the silver screen as faithfully as possible. And well, now I know that's not the case, because it's definitely not going to look like the Witcher books. none of the illustrations, and you can actually find some damn good illustrations for The Witcher on the internet, in the books directly, and so on, most of which have actually been, affirmed by Sapkowski, at least the ones published in the books. And well, I'm not. I wouldn't say anyone is really freaking out about this. People are angered, people are saddened, people are just generally disappointed. But show me a video of someone freaking out, and even if you show it to me, he's going to be in the minority, because I am subscribed to several Witcher channels or Witcher themed channels, and all of them have not only not condemned this, but have mostly gone out of their way to tiptoe around the issue. Shout out to Exletalis for not actually doing that and stating his opinions plain and simple. Much respect to you, my man. I also think this is really detracting from the main issue, and that's that Lauren Hisrich promised something, she broke that promise, and then acted as if nothing ever happened, and if she did no wrong, as if she didn't do nothing. And that's a really cowardly thing to do, and it's not going to change that. Now the plot is broken in several major areas, and I'm going to get into that in the separate video I'll make on all the changes that have been made, which is going to be a lot better researched than this particular one, where I'm just trying to kind of get my thoughts out of the way on the entire matter. But the changes Hisrich made are not just, cosmetic changes. In her mind, they certainly are, but they undermine the authenticity of the setting, and they downright break several key plot points, especially Fringilla. And I have written this down before, but I'm going to keep saying it. Fringilla's change is probably going to be one of the biggest plot holes or plot disappointments, depending on how they spin it, in the entire story. Because that has some major connotations coming with it.
Every goddamn time they cast a black person in a role made for a white person, somebody has to fucking sound the alarm and like dog whistle and like, make this huge deal. Like,
well, I wouldn't really say that matters a whole lot, Preston, because even if there were these kinds of people, and again, in the Witcher community at least, I haven't seen a single person act like this. Again, I'm still waiting for specific examples. I know that some people act like this in different kinds of media, but specifically in The Witcher, which we're talking about, I haven't seen a single person act like this. And even if this was the case, how does this validate the decisions made by Hisrich, which again are lore-breaking and are, well, done in bad faith, because they go specifically against something she promised, and she didn't even state a legitimate reason as for why she did it, and acted completely unapologetic. That's the main issue I have with the story, well, with the changes, because they have no practical use. They're purely ideological, and you can feel free to try and prove me wrong, but I still fail to see any other reason for doing them. They are going to break the story in very important aspects. They undermine the authenticity and immersive factor of the world, and Hisrich just lied about them, plain and simple, and acted completely smug and self-confident when she was confronted with lying. To her fans, nevertheless, or not, well, not to her fans, to the fans of her project, who put a lot of faith in her, me included, unfortunately.
who cares? Who fucking cares?
I'll tell you why people care. It's not, and I don't think it's because of a racist reason. Well, my reasoning is I just want a faithful adaptation. If there's a character in Game of Thrones or in The Witcher, and the character has, by design, a fucking cock sticking out of their forehead, put that in the show. I don't give a fuck. If Ned Stark has like 3 nipples, I want you to put a 3rd prosthetic nipple on Sean Bean.
I mean, I definitely agree with this, but I feel the need to stress 2 more important things. In terms of censorship, like for example, if someone had, genitalia sticking out of his forehead and that was, just really hard to edit or get past the censors, and you want this to, just not get constantly censored on multiple sites or whatever, I think you should first and foremost look at whether these changes are A, integral to the story, and B, integral to the setting. If you have a race of aliens who have genitalia between their eyes, for example, and they evolved this for a specific reason, no matter how dumb it is, you should stick to the source material and portray them as having genitalia between their eyes, because it's going to make the world more believable, even if in a somewhat retarded way, because this is a somewhat retarded example. But, and the second reason is, if this comes up later in the story, in some, even in a minor way, if this is important to the storytelling element, you should definitely keep it in. It's not a must to keep it in. Like, for example, and we'll talk about this soon, Series H. Series H is well, it's not all that important to the story. What it does is further gratify the impact of what, well, gratify is probably the wrong word. It deepens the impact of the stuff that happens to Siri. Like, Siri is a kid when some really, really terrible stuff starts happening to her, and her age serves as a further shock value. Like, wow, she's so young and she already had to go through so much, and she managed all these incredible things. And if you remove her age, or well, age her up, as was done with the Cyrilla in the TV series, you're not going to lose out on a whole lot except for the shock factor, and honestly, that might be for the best, and we'll talk about why soon enough. But that is, for example, a change people can live with, or Geralt being, massively muscular in this version. Again, Geralt is described as this, almost unassuming kind of guy. He's very thin, he's very skinny, he's sinewy almost, and not very large. And that doesn't really come into the story all that much. There's, I think, one scene where a guy underestimates him because, he's much smaller than his opponent, and Geralt kicks his ass. But apart from that, I don't think his size and the level of his muscle mass ever comes into a prominent role within the story, because at the end of the day, Geralt still is going to be more defined physically by his cat eyes and his white hair and by the sword strapped to his back than by how muscular he is, because those are the more important things about him, and those things were portrayed very well in the show. In fact, Geralt is probably the highlight of the entire trailer. So again, it's not like people don't want any changes to the source material, but there's a difference between changes that serve a purpose and that, help the showrunners in practical ways, and between changes that are done for no good reason other than an ideological one. And the changes the people have been complaining about are definitely these kinds of changes, the second kind, the bad kind.
I don't give a fuck. I just want a faithful adaptation. And I think they're just going out of their way not to do that.
Then
maybe
why
for
wasn't
money,
I hearing?
maybe for
Then why
political
wasn't I
reasons.
hearing shit about how Sean Bean was far too old to play Ned Stark? Like he was far
I
too
think there's a
old.
difference between age and racial makeup. I really think there's a difference.
Well, I mean, it made a big deal when Catelyn is no longer of birthing age, and her ability to have another child is like a huge deal.
How? Honestly, this is. I'm not sure what Preston is referring to. I don't think he's lying. I just don't think he's being genuine in this regard. Or maybe he's just embellishing, but Catelyn thinks about being able to give Ned more sons in the books, as far as I remember, and I read all the books, only once. She never even gets pregnant again before she, well, this is kind of a spoiler, but everyone and their mother already knows, before she dies. She only thinks about this once while they're together with Ned in the bed in the first book. She thinks about how she's still young enough to give Ned more children. She never gets pregnant again, she never gets an abortion again, and, well, it is really of no consequence to the story. I don't even think she was planning to remarry. Maybe she did. Maybe that's what Preston is referring to. But I don't think she did. And I looked through the Storm of Swords. I looked through all the Catelyn chapters, and I failed to find a single remark about her getting remarried. So that's definitely not an issue.
Same with Cersei, because you're talking about like remarriage and whether, in political...
Well, to be fair,
Well, yes, to be fair, Cersei in the show as well is also still of birthing age, demonstrated very clearly in the final 2 seasons when she actually gets pregnant, and we never get a resolution as to whether she would have miscarried or not because, well, the writers decided to drop a castle on her. But either way, Cersei is not a good comparison because Lena Headey, first of all, she doesn't look nearly as old as Catelyn's actress, and second of all, she's still within birthing age. Like she's not that old, neither looking nor aged in the show. And I'll tell you right away why people are not complaining about Game of Thrones aging up. Because the same people who did not complain about that are not complaining about Cyrilla being aged up. And you know why that is? Because both Cyrilla and much of the child cast of Game of Thrones, Jon, Daenerys, Arya, Bran, Sansa, all of these characters, they go through some pretty horrific stuff during their stories. And not even like very late into their stories, like the first couple of books. Atrocious, unimaginable things happen to these people. Can you imagine if you actually had, child actors of that same age go through this? Like, can you imagine 13-year-old Daenerys in episode 1 of Game of Thrones? Well, I think that would have gotten cancelled pretty damn fast. So it was done for a pragmatic reason, because you're going to have these people go through a lot of brutal and very perverse almost things. So aging them up will A, make the actors a whole lot more comfortable shooting these scenes, and B, it probably won't give you as much controversy as if you had literal children raped on screen. And it's the same reason why Cyrilla was aged up, and it's the same reason why nobody cares about Cyrilla being aging up. And the people who do care, like myself, actually said this was a good idea. Because first of all, Cyrilla is, at least I hope they stick to this, she's going to have to be very athletic and at least somewhat skilled in the stunt department. And second of all, she's going to have to portray much more emotion than the average child actor is capable of. I'm not saying there are not extremely talented child actors. What I'm saying is there are few and far between, and you can never really judge their abilities before you see them act properly. And Cyrilla is an extremely emotional character who goes through a lot during the books. So casting her as a more mature adult actress is for the general good of all parties involved. It will make the actors a lot more comfortable, it will make the producers a lot more comfortable shooting certain scenes, and it will make the people watching and reviewing the show a whole lot less uncomfortable when seeing these scenes. And that's why nobody complained about the aging up in the Game of Thrones, and that's why nobody complains about the aging up in The Witcher. Because it is a pragmatic solution done for pragmatic reasons. It's not ideological. And it's not for money either, because, well, you don't really receive, monetary increase from doing things like this. Like, at the very least, you don't get cancelled. So I guess that's one factor. But also, there's nothing really to be gained by aging up your characters from a purely financial perspective. So I don't think, again, this is a fair and accurate comparison from Preston.
They had to age up everybody in Thrones because, correct me if I'm wrong, in the first book, isn't Daenerys like 14, 15?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, she would have to be like 18, like in the show. So they had to age everybody up. Because I remember, like, isn't Catelyn like in the books, like, isn't she around like in her mid-30s to late 30s?
Yeah, both Catelyn and Ned are about 35.
Yeah, of course. Because when Robert's Rebellion starts, they're like older teenagers, and then that's 20 years after the fact when the books begin. So they're like, yeah. So that's just my take on it. So and I feel bad for Europeans because they're not as diverse as the United States is, and this is their property, and now they have to see it be Americanized.
Yeah, you don't have to feel bad for us, Carmine. We are not immature over here in Europe. We can watch shows and series which do not portray Slavic characters. Otherwise, well, we wouldn't have watched anything coming from America, because the only Slavs that ever get portrayed in America are Russians, and the only way in which they get portrayed is as the bad guys, either as the mob or as the Soviets or as the post-Soviet evil Russians, or just generally in antagonistic negative roles. At this point, when I see a Russian who is a protagonist, it's a change. It is a step aside from the mold than when I see a Russian as an antagonist. And you know what the Russians' opinion on this thing is? They find it absolutely hilarious, and their movies are just the same. Russians have this very interesting kind of trend in their movies, and it's kind of hilarious to watch, where they usually drag a Western character, usually a Frenchman or an American, into Russia and show him how brutal Russia is, and they just kind of gloat about it, saying like, you can't imagine how tough life in Russia is, like how terrible life here is, and the character always breaks down in the first half of the film and then hardens up and starts appreciating the Russian way of life in the second part. And you know, it's kind of cringy in many cases, and it's kind of hilarious in others, but either way, you don't have to pity us, Preston. Like, we're not immature enough to not be able to watch American media. The only thing we mind is fairly beloved franchise being politicized and changed up for no good reason other than the ideological whims of the producers. That's the thing most people are pissed about, not the fact that we won't see any Slavic characters, because there are no Slavic characters in The Witcher. Of course, a Slavic theme to the country, to the music, and so on would have been a welcome addition, I will not lie about that, but far more people are outraged about, key core characters being changed racially, which breaks the story and undermines the setting for no good reason, than they are about not having, enough babushkas running around the streets. So, yes, I definitely think that this is the greater issue.
I remember there's this video game called Metro. It's by a Russian guy, the Russian book series, about subways in Russia, and they wanted to make an American version of it, a movie, and the guy said no because he knew they were going to Americanize it. It's going to take place in D.C. and it's going to just be completely different. And his reasoning for it was Russian stories and U.S. stories are vastly different. In U.S. stories, American stories have a happy ending. Russian stories apparently don't. Russian stories are all about surviving just for the sake of it, just to spite whoever else, just to raise a glass and say, fuck you world, I survived.
Somewhat crudely put, but yes, in general true. Like, it's no surprise that some of the best authors of psychological realism, such as Dostoevsky, were born in Russia, and it's no surprise that some of the best tragedies, or at least tragically infused literature, such as Tolstoy's works, were also created in Russia, because Russia is a hard and unforgiving country. It's a hard and unforgiving land. People are very cruel and very brutal in many regards, and, well, their stories reflect this. As someone who has read plenty of Russian and Ukrainian literature in my time, I can confirm that, yes, Russian stories are very bitter, very cynical in many regards, and they are deeply, if they're done correctly, they can be deeply psychological. And then we're, of course, also come to the Russian patriotic stories, which are the complete opposite of this, but those often serve as propaganda, so I'm not really commenting on that part of the Russian genre. And in Poland and Slovakia and Czech Republic, this is not as bad. Like, we also have a fair bit of light-hearted stories, but we're also a lot more westernized than the Russians or the Ukrainians or the Georgians. Well, the Georgians are not Slavs per se, but they are one of the more European Eastern cultures. So we also have this kind of cynicism present in many of our stories. Like, yeah, life is tough, life is cruel, life is a bitch. And Americans just don't usually have this. And I'm not saying at all that this is a bad thing. In fact, I often prefer these kinds of stories because I find nihilism as a concept to be despicable and the stuff of cowards. But either way, many of the Russian works would simply be incompatible with the very hopeful, very golden future American point of view, and that's exactly why Metro was not adapted, or at least not yet. We know who is eventually going to adapt everything into one homogeneous mold, don't we?
And I kind of get it. I just feel a little bad for, like, the Polish people who have to see, like, their property being a little Americanized when they probably didn't want it to be.
Well, with Picard, they had an Englishman play a Frenchman, and and next generation just all fell apart.
Right. And before we do wrap up the Witcher conversation and go on to the next one, I just want to say I really don't care if they change a certain character's ethnicity. For once I just want a faithful adaptation from book to show. And even in this thing, besides character like changes, it seems like they're gonna go in like a different direction than what's on paper, which kind of annoys me. And at this point, you should just call it a reimagining instead of a faithful adaptation. But I also just feel bad for mostly like Polish people because this is their baby, this is their property, and to see it Americanized must really irk them. But guys, if you are interested in checking out The Witcher when it does come out, which I highly recommend, we will be covering it.
Well, I certainly feel bad for Polish people as well. I feel bad for every fan of Witcher, no matter the nationality, because he probably got into The Witcher because he liked it the way it was written. And, well, Karma might not have an issue with just changing ethnicity, I do, but the issue that bothers me even more is which characters got changed their ethnicity. And, well, again, I'll make a separate video covering this soon-ish, probably rather later than sooner, but that video is going to hopefully be a lot better articulated because, well, again, this is just me pouring out my thoughts on what I generally conceive, what I generally imagine to be wrong with this entire dilemma. And, well, I hope I'll address everything wrong with the show, not necessarily just the race bending, but the changes in general and why they either won't work or will end up creating something, but that something will not be The Witcher as we know and love it. So, that's about me done. Until next time, good fortune to you.